One summer night in the 1970s, a young woman named Hana was sitting next to her husband at a blackjack table inside of the Genting Highlands Casino, which was this huge casino in central Malaysia. The room they were in was bright, it was loud, there was people everywhere, there's cigarette smoke hovering in the air, lots of drinking and chatting and laughing and gambling. And so as Hana is sitting in this environment, she was doing her best not to let her nerves get the best of her, but she couldn't help it. I mean, she was really feeling anxious because her husband had just bet all their chips on this one hand. So her husband had been dealt his 2 cards and they totaled 19, which was basically good because in blackjack, you're trying to get to 21. You want your cards in total to equal 21, but you don't want to go over or you bust, you lose. And so 19 is pretty good, but you're playing really against the dealer. And so basically it's between you and the dealer who can get closest to 21 without going over. So the dealer had 2 cards, one was face up and one was face down. The face up card was a 10, and so Hana is anxiously waiting to see this other card flipped over, just praying it's not a 10, because that would give him 20, and that would beat, her husband's 19, and they would lose. And so the dealer, he flips over this other card, and it's a 4. So now he's got 14, and so that's good. It means Hana and her husband, they're still in the lead here. But the dealer will keep on hitting, so adding more cards to the pile here, adding to their total score until they either hit 17 at least, or until they beat you, or until they bust. So they're going to keep on drawing more cards. And so the dealer draws another card, he puts it face down, and it's an 8. And so now collectively, the dealer has 22, they've gone over 21, they've busted, and Hana and her husband have won. And so Hana, she turns to her husband and she's overjoyed. I mean, they've just gambled all their money and they've won. I mean, this is a huge win. And Hana and her husband, they didn't really come for money here. I mean, they're very modest people. They had saved up money for this trip. They had really wanted to come to this casino for a long time. And now it was like their luck was just incredible. They're having this unbelievable run. They had won a bunch of money beforehand and now they had just won this hand and they doubled their money. Like, this is incredible. And so at this point, Hana and her husband, they take all their chips, they leave the blackjack table. Everyone's like so excited for them, like the energy is awesome. And so Hana and her husband, they make their way over to the cashier and they cash all their chips. They get all this cash. And Hana's talking to her husband, like, this is awesome. Like, we were gonna have to drive home tonight. Let's get a room here. Let's use some of this money and like stay at the lavish hotel they have. Maybe we can go back to the casino tomorrow. Let's make a vacation out of this. But after cashing all their chips, Hana's husband, he didn't seem too inclined to go spend the money on a hotel room or a restaurant or whatever. He told her, he's like, I don't know, like I feel really lucky, like I'm on a roll here. I don't want to just like be done. I think I should go play slots and try to win a little bit more money. I think we can win more money. And Hana's like, are you crazy? Like, this is the most money we've ever won ever. Like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. If we stay and continue to gamble, we're just gonna lose the money. Like, let's take the win. Let's get the hotel room. Let's just do that. But Hana's husband, he was not having it, and he literally just took their money and was like, no, I'm gonna go do slots now. And he walked over to a slot machine. And Hana's like, oh my God. And she follows her husband over to the slot machine, and before long, he's playing the slots and it's not going well, and Hana's trying to convince him to stop, but he wouldn't have it, and he was so committed, he just kept going, and wouldn't you know it, after 2 hours of this, all the money was gone. Well, actually, it was not entirely all gone. He still had a little bit of money that they had intentionally set aside just to cover the hotel, because they needed a place to stay that night and they had stayed later at the casino. And so literally they are down to just enough to stay in the hotel. And so at this point, Hana, she's already accepted that they've lost all their winnings. And she's telling her husband, like, please, let's just walk away. Let's use this money. Let's just stay in the hotel. It is what it is. And they're about to leave when her husband's like, one more, turns around, puts it in the slot machine, pulls the lever, lose. Now they literally have no money. They have actually no more money. They can't get a hotel. It's the middle of the night, late. They have nowhere to stay, and now they have to drive home. and the drive is going to be awful. Like, Hana is furious with her husband. Her husband feels like, oh, it's just bad luck. It's not my fault. But Hana's like, it is your fault. You should have left. So it's just this awful, awful exit from the casino. Like, this is about to be the worst ride home ever. About 20 minutes later, Hana was sitting in the passenger seat and her husband was driving, and they're cruising down this road. It's the middle of the night. They've passed no cars as they're driving. They're in this desolate stretch on their way back to their home. And, you know, as expected, this has been a treacherous ride so far. They fought at the beginning and now they're not talking. And so they're driving along, and Hana's just looking out the window at all the trees. It's very jungly and swampy off to the side on either side of the road. And they're driving along. And at some point, as Hana is just desperate to get home, she just wants to go to bed. She doesn't even care about the money at this point. She just literally wants to get in her bed. They're driving along when the car starts to sputter, like it's running out of gas. And immediately Hana looks over at her husband like, are you kidding me? And her husband's looking over at her like, knowing that he's gonna bring even more wrath down on himself from his wife. And he's just like, I'm sorry, like, I didn't know it was that low. Like, I didn't know the tank was that low. And before long, he had to pull over on the side of the road because their car was out of gas. Like, they couldn't go any farther. And so Hana, as the car has come to a stop on the side of the road, she just looks at her husband and she's like, wow, like, this night really couldn't get any worse. Like, are you kidding me? We are stranded in the middle of nowhere. We got no money. What are we gonna do? And so Hana's husband, you know, he obviously knew this was not good. Like, he knows he's the one that was supposed to put gas in the car and he didn't. You know, he's sort of been the architect behind this whole disaster of a night here with his decision to keep on gambling. And so he just says to Hana, look, you stay here, just stay in the car. I have a gas can. I'll just walk to the nearest gas station. I'll get some gas. I'll bring it back. I'll fill it up. We'll be home soon. We can't be that far away anyways. Like, it can't be that far away. So just stay here. I'll go get gas. And so Hana's like, okay, fine. Go get gas. And so Hana just stays in the car, and her husband gets out. He goes in the back of the car. He gets the gas can. And then before long, Hana watches as her husband walks ahead of the car and disappears into the darkness.
BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy.
And so after Hana's husband has walked off, she knows it's going to be at least, 30, 40 minutes, before he gets gas and comes back. And, she's exhausted. And so she makes sure all the doors are locked, and then she leans back her seat and she just tries to go to sleep. And pretty quickly she does doze off. But then at some point, maybe 5-10 minutes later, she just kind of inexplicably wakes up. There was no reason why she woke up. She just opened her eyes and she, for a second was a little bit disoriented. When you fall asleep for a few minutes like that, you'll kind of wake up like, what just happened? She's disoriented and she remembered, oh, that's right. We had this horrible night, the casino went horribly. We ran out of gas. Oh, that's right. Like, I'm living out this nightmare. Okay, now I know where I am. And so after getting her bearings, Hana just rolled over in her seat and tried to go back to sleep. But this time, after closing her eyes, after just a few seconds, she heard this loud thumping noise on the roof of the car. And it was loud enough that she opened her eyes back up and, there's no sunroof or anything, so she couldn't see what it was. And it was so dark outside and there were no streetlights out there that she couldn't just look out the window and see what it was. But she knew her husband could not possibly be back yet. And even if he was, why would he be banging on the roof? But then she remembered they had parked right next to this jungly, swampy area, just right off the side of the road. And, there were probably some low-hanging branches, and it was entirely possible that the wind had caused a branch to just bang against the roof of the car. And so that's what she assumed it was, and after realizing that, she just got comfortable again and closed her eyes. But then a few seconds later, she heard another thump on the roof of the car. And again, she instinctively looked out the window, and she's sort of like trying to figure out what it is, but she can't see anything. There's no sign of her husband walking up the road. There's nothing. And so again, she just tells herself, okay, again, it's just got to be this branch. But then after hearing it a second time, the thumping sound, it began to sort of persist. It's not super loud, but it's pretty consistent. It's like a thumping sound on the roof of the car. And it did basically sound like a branch hitting the roof, but it's just a nuisance. And more than anything, she's just frustrated because it's loud enough that she's not going to be able to sleep. And so she's not frightened by it. She's a little bit, unnerved by it perhaps, because it's the middle of the night. She's all alone. But for the most part, she's just like, oh, great. Now I can't sleep. And so she's just sitting in her car, and the thumping is continuing, and she's just staring straight ahead. And she knew, she was sort of being a little cowardly. She figured I probably should just get out and just confirm this really is a branch. But there was just some part of her that's like, I am in the middle of nowhere. It's the middle of the night. It's a little bit creepy, so I'm not going to do that. So she's just looking straight ahead, really waiting for her husband. And so thump, thump, thump. She's just looking straight ahead. And then a little while later, she doesn't see her husband, but she sees headlights appear that are coming in her direction. And to this point, she hadn't seen a single other car since they had been on this road, basically, or at least since they had pulled over, because they were out of gas. She had not seen another car. And so here comes a car approaching, and she's thinking, oh, it's got to be my husband. He must have found someone who, heard about our story, and he's got gas, and they're just giving him a ride up here to come drop him off. He's going to fill up the car. We're going to be out of here in a second. Thank goodness. And so Hana, she doesn't get out of the car. She just sits there, waiting for this car to approach. And the car, as it gets closer and closer, it appears to slow down. And it's too dark to see, who's in the car, whether it's her husband or not. But this car is clearly slowing down. It appears to recognize her car and where she is. And she's expecting at any point this car is going to fully stop and her husband's going to get out. And so she's just waiting, and the car is getting closer and it's slowing down. But then sort of inexplicably, right as this car is very close to her car, the car just peels out and speeds down the road, just away from her as fast as they could go, and then they're gone. And so immediately Hana's like, okay, one, clearly not my husband, so that's disappointing. But two, like, what was that? Why did they do that? Why did they slow down and speed up like that? And the whole time this is going on, it's just constant thumping on the roof of her car, which by now she's almost zoned out, but it's persisting. And so at this point, Hana went from being basically annoyed with the situation to now starting to feel a little bit freaked out. I mean, her husband's still not back. It's been, at this point, kind of a while since he left, and she doesn't really know how far the nearest gas station's going to be or how long it's going to take him, but she's starting to think, like, it should be soon. He should be getting back here. And this weirdness with the car speeding off like that wasn't normal. And then also there was just this constant thumping on the roof of her car. And she, again, had told herself it was a branch, but she's starting to wonder, like, is it? But like, what else could it be? And so now Hana is sitting here staring out, into the darkness in front of her, like desperately wishing her husband would show up like any second here. Like, please, like, come out of the darkness and rescue me, because this is getting really uncomfortable. The time kept on ticking on, and her husband didn't show up, and the thumping continued, and no other cars came through. And so Hana slowly began to worry that maybe her husband got lost. Like, maybe he's not able to find where she is. Is she just like stranded out here? Like, what's going on? And so as Hana is sort of beginning to spiral, like as her thoughts are beginning to spiral and she's getting more and more worried, she started to give half a thought to leaving the car and forget about what's happening with the roof. Like, I'm gonna go find my husband. Like, she thought about going and looking for him, but then she thought, like, oh, what's gonna happen is I'm gonna get out, I'm gonna go look for him, and we're gonna like pass each other in the dark. He's not gonna know I'm looking for him, I'm not gonna find him, and now he's gonna be back at the car and I'm missing. And so I'm just gonna create more problems. And so she tells herself that really the only thing she can do that's responsible is just stay put. And so there she stays. And the thumping continues, and her husband continues not to show up. And like the time as it's going by, it's like agonizingly slow. And now she's getting really worked up that like, she's being watched or something. Like she's really starting to get paranoid. And all of a sudden, down the road, she sees something. And it's really a huge relief when she sees it at first. She sees more headlights. And at first she's thinking, oh, thank goodness, this has got to be my husband. Like this is a car coming up the road. He's going to be in there this time. He's going to get out of here. He's got the gas. We're going to get out of here. But as the headlights appeared over the horizon coming towards her, she realized it was not an ordinary car. It was not just headlights. There were also lights on top of this vehicle. It was a police car. And so this police car is cruising down the road and, Hana's thinking, well, it could still be my husband. Maybe he got a ride from the police. But then she's thinking, oh my goodness, like, has something happened to him? Are they coming to tell me that something's happened to my husband? Like she's having all these terrible thoughts. And so this police car, they come to a stop on the other side of the road. And at first, Hana is just like unsure what she should even be doing. Like, should she get out to greet them? Should she wait here? But as she's just staring across the road at the two officers that are in this vehicle, and she doesn't see her husband in there, she sees the officer that's closest to her, the driver. He gets out of the car and he stands on the road and then he draws his pistol and he aims it at her. Like he's aiming the gun at her and the car she's in. And she's like, what is going on here? And so she just freezes, doesn't say or do anything. And the other officer in the passenger side, so on the far side of the car, he gets out of the cruiser as well, but he's got a megaphone in his hand. And so through this megaphone, he kind of leans out and he barks 3 orders to Hana. The first order is get out of the car. The second order is come over to our car. And the third order is don't look back. And so at this point, Hana realized that the first officer who stepped out of the car with the gun, he wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at the roof of her car. That's where his gun was pointed right now. And so between that and the fact that she's been listening to this thumping sound for the last 45 minutes, assuming it was a branch, she's now realizing there's no way it's a branch. Like she sort of sensed it couldn't be, like it had to be something else, but she had sort of convinced herself, oh, it's a tree branch. Now she knows it's not. And so she had no idea what could possibly be on the roof of her car. But she knew whatever it was, it had to be bad. And so Hana, all she wants to do is get out of this car and go over there. She doesn't want to be here anymore. I mean, this whole thing has been awful and now she's terrified, but she's like frozen. Like, what does she do? Like, what's going on? But again, the officer with the bullhorn comes across and says, hey, get out of the car, come over to us and don't look back. Right now, get up, go. And so Hana is like, I just gotta go. And so she opens her door, and as fast as she can, she gets out, she doesn't look back, she banks around the car, and across the street she goes, and the whole time she's thinking, oh, something's gonna grab me, but she gets to the cop car, she throws open the door, and she jumps inside, and at first, she adheres to their orders. She doesn't look back, as they told her to. She didn't look back. But now that she's safely inside the cop car, there's, 2 officers protecting her, one with a gun drawn, pointed at her car, she couldn't help herself. She had to see what was on the roof of her car. So she went over to the window and she looked. And as soon as she saw what was on the roof of her car, she just starts screaming. And at the same time, the officer who was still standing out there with his gun drawn, he begins just firing nonstop at her car. And so Hana, she screams, she ducks down behind the door. She can't see anything. There's just this constant barrage of gunfire, blasting the car and whatever was on the roof of the car. And then, Hana, she's tucked down and she's thinking this is a nightmare. Like, how is this real? She hears the sound of that officer who was shooting and the other officer. They get out of the car. She hears them run across the street towards her car. The shooting kind of stops and it's just like the shuffling of feet. And then she hears this loud thumping sound as something really heavy, slammed into the pavement. And then she heard the sound of something big, running off into the jungle, into the tree line, like trees just, moving all around. And then there's just silence And then a moment later, she hears the sound of the officers coming back across the street. She's still tucked down. She can't look out the window. She just hears the sound of their footsteps. It's definitely them. And as they're getting closer, she can hear them like trying to make sense of what they just saw. Like they don't even know what they just saw. And at some point, Hana's door opens up, and on the other side, it's the officer who had the megaphone, and he just looks ashen-faced. He's very shaken up. And he begins to try to explain what he's just seen, but it's clear he can't even describe it. And as he's trying to do it, like Hana, she's crying, she's so upset, and she just tells him, like, don't even tell me. Like, I saw it too. When Hana did look back, so when she went against the police's orders and she looked out the window back at her car, what she saw at first, like, didn't even compute. She saw that clearly there was no branch striking the roof of her car. What she saw was a woman. There was a woman on the roof of her car. This woman is like dirty and her hair is matted and it was like kind of covering like the front of her head. Like she's just like weirdly positioned on the roof of the car. Like that clearly was what was making the banging sound for the 45 minutes or so that she was over there. And so that alone is like horrific. But then in this instant that Hana had looked over and seen this woman, the woman, she kind of appeared to be eating something. Like that was the gesticulation that she was doing. It sort of looked like she was eating something. And she looked up for a second as Hana is staring across the road and her matted hair kind of parted. And the woman is looking right at Hana and there's blood all over her mouth and her chin. And then Hana saw what she was eating, and that's the thing that made her start screaming and prompted the police to start shooting. The woman was chewing on Hana's husband's severed head. And so as soon as the police open fire, this cannibal woman lets go of the head and it falls to the pavement and it makes that loud thumping sound that Hana would recall hearing as she's crouched down, wishing this was some nightmare. And then this woman, she leaps off the roof of the car, under a hail of gunfire. She lands on all fours, and like an animal, she gallops into the tree line and vanishes. And so the two officers, they ran across the street after her, but quickly realized, like, she was gone. And so they called for backup. Backup arrives, and all these officers go out into the jungle, and they can't find this woman. She's gone. But they would find the rest of the body. So the rest of the husband's body was actually not far from the vehicle. It was just laying out on the side of the road, sort of tucked up against the tree line. And so today, because this woman was never caught, there's not really a good explanation of what actually happened. The only evidence we have is that obviously Hana's husband died. We have his body, he was decapitated. We have strong witness testimony, not just from Hana, but from these two police officers, and in some ways, the backup officers that also showed up, but they were there sort of after the fact. But there's also one other piece of evidence that really is the sole reason in some ways that this story lives on, and that we're still talking about it today. And it's because it's far and away the most compelling piece of evidence we have that this really happened the way Hana and the officers said. It is this picture of the woman on the roof of the car moments before the police opened fire.
On the evening of June 17th, 2004, a 21-year-old woman named Molly Daniels pulled into the driveway of her little home that she shared with her husband and two kids in suburban Texas. It had been a long day for Molly at the home remodeling business where she worked as a receptionist, and so now that she was home, the last thing she wanted to do was go inside and make dinner for her family. And so, after turning off her car, Molly just sat there in the driveway for a couple of minutes, just zoned out looking out the window, but eventually she kind of snapped out of it, she gathered up her things, she got out of the car, and she made her way up to the front door. And as soon as she stepped into her home, that bad mood she was feeling from work was wiped away and replaced with happiness. Because the first thing she heard the second she was in her home was the sound of her 4-year-old son, Caleb, hysterically laughing. And so Molly walked into the back room and she found her son, along with her husband, Clay, rolling around on the ground, tickling each other. And next to them was their 1-year-old daughter sitting on the rug, laughing as well and clapping and watching along.
And so as soon as Molly walked into the room, Clay, who was underneath Caleb, stopped for a second and grinned up at Molly. Molly smiled back, and then Clay and Caleb went back to wrestling, and the 1-year-old continued to laugh and play along. And so Molly suddenly felt so content with her life. It was so incredible to have a family of her own. And so, with a big smile on her face now, she headed off into the kitchen to make dinner. Life had been tough financially for the Daniels family recently. The city where they lived, called Leander, was located just north of Austin, Texas, and it was getting more and more expensive every single year. Clay, who was 2 years older than Molly, he was 23, he was a mechanic, but he had been out of work for months, and so he had just been staying home with the kids. As for Molly, she had her job as a receptionist, but it paid very little, and so ultimately the family was just barely scraping by. But despite the financial hardship they were under, Molly was so thankful that she had a husband in Clay that was so good with their kids, especially Caleb, the 4-year-old son, because Caleb was actually Molly's son from a previous relationship, and she was worried that maybe Clay wouldn't necessarily treat him like his own, but Clay had totally stepped up to the plate and become Caleb's father, and Caleb definitely viewed Clay as his dad, and so that relationship was as close as if they were biologically related, and so Molly just felt so grateful for that. That evening, the family sat down and had dinner together, and then afterwards, Molly and Clay got the kids off to bed, and then Molly and Clay stayed up and watched TV together. But after a while, Molly said she was tired and she was going to go to bed. Clay said he'd be staying up for a bit longer, and so the couple kissed, said goodnight, and Molly made her way upstairs. At around 10:45 p.m. that night, so about 15 minutes after Molly went upstairs, she was laying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard the sound of their front door open and then shut, and then she heard the sound of their car being turned on and leaving the driveway. Now, this was not a big deal for Molly because earlier that night, Clay had mentioned kind of offhandedly that he wanted to go see his mom that night, that he might swing over there and say hello. He had a couple of paperback books that he wanted to give her, and so Molly knew there was a chance he could be doing that, and so she assumed that had to be what she was hearing, and so she forgot about it and fell asleep. The next morning, when Molly woke up at 6 a.m., she rolled over and she saw Clay was not in bed with her. Now, she wasn't immediately alarmed by this because it wasn't unusual for Clay to get up really early. And so Molly climbed out of bed, she made her way over to the window, and she looked down at the driveway, expecting to see their car back, meaning Clay would be downstairs somewhere. But she looked in the driveway, there was no car. And so suddenly feeling kind of panicked, Molly went downstairs and looked around the house. Clay wasn't there, and so she picked up the phone and she called Clay's mother. And when Clay's mother picked up, Molly said, "Hey, is Clay with you? He said he was stopping by last night. I heard him leave. Is he with you?" And Clay's mother would say, "No, he's not here. And in fact, I didn't even know he was going to be stopping by last night. I haven't heard from him." The drive from Molly and Clay's house to Clay's mother's house was 40 miles of twisting, fairly dangerous highway. Now, Clay regularly made this trip to and from his mother's house, and so Molly was never that worried about him going on this 40-mile stretch. But suddenly, without saying it, both Molly and Clay's mother were thinking the same thing. Did Clay get into a car accident last night on the drive to his mother's house? And so at some point, Clay's mom on the phone tells Molly to stay calm, stay at the house with your kids. I'm going to get in the car. I'm going to drive the route that Clay would have taken back to you, and we'll see if we can find him. And then as soon as the two women hung up, Clay's mother ran to her car. She jumped inside, she turned it on, she peeled out of the driveway and began speeding those 40 miles back towards Clay and Molly's house. And she had only gotten about halfway along this trip when up ahead she saw all these flashing blue and white lights. She saw crime scene tape across the whole road. This was a section of the highway that was heavily forested on either side, and she could see traffic was backed up very far on the other end and as well on her side. And so of course Clay's mother is thinking, this is my son, he's been in an accident right here. And so she pulls over to the side of the road, she throws it in park, she gets out and runs to the nearest police officer and begins frantically asking them, what's happened here, what's happened? And as she's talking to the officer, she notices behind him there's all this smoke coming up from the forest. There's a fire down in the forest. And so she's craning her neck to look down and see what it is. And the officer tried to stop her, but finally she pushed past him and she looked and she saw there was a car on fire that clearly had flown off the road. And so in a total panic, she begins asking the officer, "Do you know who it is? Is it my son? Is it Clay?" The officer told her to please calm down. "We have no idea whose car this is. We're trying to figure it out. The fire department hasn't even put the fire out yet. We don't know enough to tell you anything." But at this point, Clay's mother could not wait any longer for answers. And so she turned around, she ran back to her car, she hopped in it, and she made her way around this big police barricade and sped the rest of the way to Clay and Molly's house. And there, she picked up Molly, she drove her back, and when they got there, both women are totally hysterical, but they run right up to the police tape, and they look down in the direction of where this fire had been, which now had been put out. There was just smoke coming off of this car frame that had been totally burned out. And immediately, when Molly looked down there, she recognized the car. Or I should say, she recognized the shape of the car, because the fire had totally eviscerated the car. But Molly, she was seeing the frame was about the right size, and she was seeing that strewn around this burned out car were all these paperback books that had been burned up partially in this fire. And she knew that Clay had likely been on his way to his mother's house with all these paperback books inside of the vehicle. And so she knew this had to be Clay. And at the same time that Molly is having this horrible realization, the fire department down below was able to actually get into the burned out vehicle. They opened up the door and they found right away there was a body in the driver's seat. And so between the size of the body, all the paperback books that Molly said, that would be something Clay would have, along with several other personal effects that were found inside of the car, like Clay's prized Harley-Davidson pin that he always wore in his hat, it was obvious that this was Clay. When word spread about Clay's death, Molly's neighbors and friends in Leander jumped into action. People loved Molly in Leander. She was this very sweet, very kind woman who was a little bit socially awkward, but they had found ever since she had married Clay, she had really found some more confidence and just seemed happier. And so it was totally devastating to see Clay be pulled from her life like that. And so very quickly, the community in Leander raised $1,000 and they gave it to Molly and her kids. And then also neighbors began dropping off food and stocking their fridge with groceries. And even though Molly couldn't even eat, she was so grief-stricken from the loss of Clay, she still very much appreciated the effort that people were making to comfort her. But as the community rallied around Molly and her kids to get them through this difficult time, the police were starting to ask some questions about how exactly this crash that had killed Clay actually happened. Because there were some oddities about the scene of the accident. The biggest being, there were no skid marks on the road, which meant Clay had not hit the brakes before swerving off the road and crashing down in the trees below. And secondly, they didn't really understand how the fire that had started after this crash had gotten so incredibly hot that it basically had completely melted away every part of the vehicle save for the frame. And also Clay's body had been totally destroyed. I mean, the authorities had seen fires after car accidents, but nothing like this. This looked very unique. And so investigators started to wonder if they were really dealing with a car accident or if this was a murder. And on June 22nd, just 4 days after Clay was found, investigators would learn from the crime lab that their suspicions had been correct. We did a merch drop last year and the gear was awesome. We were so happy with it, but the shipping times were ridiculously long. We had big shipping issues. We actually had to shut down that merch drop early to deal with those issues. Well, we fixed those issues, and so shipping will no longer be an issue for us now or in the future. And so, as a token of our appreciation for you all in putting up with the shipping issues in the first drop, we've decided to do a massive sale. For context, this sale is going to lose us money, but it's the only way to do it because you all deserve it. You're awesome. Thank you. As of this video's release, shop MrBallen.com is officially back open for business, and everything, signature flannels, hoodies, hats, Bell's Canyon t-shirts, posters, all of it are 50% off until supplies run out. So again, go to shopmrballen.com and get your official MrBallen merchandise 50% off right now until supplies run out. Thank you. It would turn out there was lighter fluid found all over the front seat of the car, so that was the reason the fire had gotten so big. And then during the autopsy, Clay's lungs showed that he had not ever inhaled any soot. meaning he was dead when the fire started. And so very likely, Clay was murdered and the car accident was staged. And interestingly, when word started to get out in town that Clay's death seemed suspicious and that maybe he was murdered, it turned out nobody was surprised. Because even though Molly adored Clay and thought he was a great father, most other people in Leander hated him. He was known around town to be this totally short-tempered guy who would just pick fights with people out of the blue. In fact, at Clay's own funeral, his literal best friend stood up to eulogize him, and during this, he said, "I think honestly, the world is a better place without Clay." And so investigators began looking into Clay's background to see if they could find connections with people that might have a grudge or some reason to be mad at Clay who might want to do him harm. And very quickly, investigators found something. Just 10 days before Clay was found, he had pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl. But the sentence he received was incredibly light. He was given 30 days in jail, which he had not served yet, and probation. Now, the father of the victim, the 7-year-old girl, was absolutely furious about Clay's light sentence. And in fact, just a couple of days before Clay died, the father threatened to kill Clay. So investigators quickly tracked down this father, and they brought him in for questioning, but very quickly this father made it clear to police that yes, he hated Clay, yes, he had threatened to kill Clay, but no, he had nothing to do with what happened to Clay, and the father had an alibi to back that up. And so after confirming his alibi, the police somewhat reluctantly allowed the father to leave, even though to a lot of them, he just really seemed like the slam dunk primary suspect, but he couldn't have been. And so with him out of the picture, the police were kind of back to the drawing board. And so they decided they would actually go talk to Molly and see if maybe she could shed some light on who else might have wanted to hurt Clay. Now, in their previous conversations with Molly, police found her to be incredibly polite and also at the same time very, very upset about the death of her husband. But this time, when investigators showed up at Molly's house and she brought them into her kitchen where they sat down to talk, it was like the police got a totally different Molly. And it happened as soon as they asked her, hey, who do you think could have hurt your husband? It was like Molly suddenly became impatient. She didn't have time for these questions. And finally, she just said, you know what? I think Clay was depressed because he had that prison sentence that was coming up that he didn't want to serve. And so probably he just killed himself. I think that's what happened. And so now I need you guys to leave. And so the officers didn't make a fuss. They didn't fight Molly on this. They just got up, they left. But once they were back out in their car, they looked at each other and they both agreed that Molly's behavior was very suspicious, and it made them think, maybe she actually knows more about what happened to Clay and she's kind of trying to cover it up and make the police go away. And over the next couple of weeks, as police began investigating Molly, they discovered quite a bit of evidence that made them even more suspicious of her. For one thing, there was Clay's $110,000 life insurance policy that Molly was entitled to, and Molly had apparently been calling the insurance company nearly non-stop every day, trying to get them to wire that payment as soon as possible. And Molly apparently was telling people in town how excited she was about getting that money. Also, police learned, after talking to Molly's neighbors, that Molly was starting to date again already. Just 3 weeks after her husband has died, she's out there on the dating scene, even bringing home one of her boyfriends and having him live with her 2 kids. And according to Molly's babysitter, this new boyfriend that was coming into the house was really upsetting Caleb, the 4-year-old, who had been so close with Clay. The babysitter would say that Caleb, who normally was a very mellow child back when Clay was still alive, was now very violent and emotional, and periodically he would just stop, look up into the sky, and scream, "I love you, Daddy!" But when the babysitter brought this up to Molly and said, really, you should get your son some help here, Molly got angry and said Caleb was fine, it was none of her business, and then she slammed the door on the babysitter. But despite how suspicious Molly now seemed, there wasn't any real evidence that actually linked her to Clay's death. And so finally, in the fall of 2004, so several months after Clay's death, and still the police have not figured out who killed him or how he died and how he wound up in this inferno by the side of the road, they decided to kind of reinvigorate this investigation into Molly. They really wanted to find evidence that she was involved in Clay's death. And so they decided to put a surveillance team on Molly 24/7. And at first, the undercover police would report that Molly's behavior was incredibly routine. She basically did the same things every single day. She got up, she got the kids out the door, she went to work. Afterwards, she picked her kids up from the babysitter, she went home, she fed her kids, and then they all went to bed, and they did it all again the next day. The only deviation from her schedule was periodically she would go out after work to run some errands, like go to the grocery store. But then on December 3rd, so 6 months after Clay was found, Molly would finally break her routine. On that day, Molly, on her way home from work, made a pit stop in this parking lot near several local stores. So she parked her car, she got out, but then instead of walking into one of these stores to run an errand or something, she walked to a dark-colored Mustang that was parked in the parking lot as well, and a guy was driving it. This guy the cop didn't recognize with dark hair. Molly walked up to him and began talking to this guy through the window, and then at some point, Molly began very suspiciously looking over her shoulder like she was trying to see if anyone was watching her, and then she walked around and climbed into the Mustang with this guy. She shut the door, and then the two of them drove off together. And so the undercover police officer followed after them, and eventually the Mustang containing Molly and this guy pulled into the parking lot of a Taco Bell, a fast food restaurant. And so they stopped, they got out, and the undercover officer watched as the two of them casually walked inside of the Taco Bell. They ordered some food, and they sat down by the window to eat. And so by this point, the undercover officer, he's not seen anything incriminating happening here, but what he's seeing is such a break from her routine that it just seemed really suspicious, and he wanted to go inside and have a look. And so he called for backup from another undercover officer who was part of the surveillance team. He came into the parking lot, and then the two of them, these two officers who are wearing plain civilian clothes, they both got out of their unmarked vehicles and they casually walked into the Taco Bell and they got in line to order food. And as they were standing in line, one of the undercover officers casually turned around in line and very nonchalantly scanned the room, like he was looking at nothing in particular. But in reality, what he was doing was taking a quick glimpse at Molly and this guy she was with. And when the officer took this quick glimpse, he noticed something very strange about the guy that Molly was sitting with. Something that the officer hadn't seen before, but now that he was up close, he could see it. And as soon as he saw this strange thing, the officer tapped on his partner's shoulder like, all right, we're doing something here. The officer reached down, put his hand on his concealed gun underneath his shirt, and then he walked across the restaurant, not even pretending to be undercover at this point. He's basically giving away that he's a cop. He strode right over to their table, and when he stopped in front of them, Molly and the guy she was with both looked up at him in surprise, and the officer just stared down at the guy. Not at Molly, just at the guy. The strange thing the officer had caught when he looked over at the guy was that he recognized him. This was someone he knew personally from being in law enforcement in the area. This guy was Clay Daniels, Molly's supposedly dead husband. He had just clearly dyed his blonde hair black. It would turn out Molly and Clay had staged his death in order to keep him from having to serve that prison sentence for the sexual assault charge, and so they could collect on the $110,000 life insurance policy. The body that was found inside of the burned out car was obviously not Clay's. It was the body of an 81-year-old woman who Clay had dug up from some isolated cemetery, thrown inside of his vehicle, and then pushed his vehicle off the road and lit on fire with lighter fluid. And so that was why there was no skid marks up on the road, because again, this was not a car accident, it was staged. And so after Clay and Molly staged Clay's death, it actually worked. People really believed that Clay had died. They were questioning how he died, but nobody really thought it wasn't Clay. And so their plan was working. But after 3 weeks of being apart, with Clay kind of hanging out by himself away from the town, Clay and Molly just couldn't stand to be apart any longer. And so Clay dyed his blonde hair black. That was the only thing he did to disguise his identity. And then he just moved back into the home with Molly and the kids. And so that was the new boyfriend that neighbors were seeing Molly with. She was not actually going out on new dates. She was just back with Clay. And Clay's stepson, Caleb, the 4-year-old, he immediately recognized that his father was back, even though he had black hair. But Molly and Clay had had convinced the little boy that Clay was not really Clay. Instead, this was the new boyfriend, Jake. This is very likely why Caleb had begun acting out. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't right, but not old enough to understand that his parents were lying to him. It's unclear why Molly and Clay, who lived together shamelessly, decided to have this weird rendezvous in the parking lot inside of Clay's Mustang and then go to Taco Bell and eat together. But regardless, it was this secret meetup that ultimately led to them getting caught. Molly and Clay were both charged with insurance fraud, and they both pled guilty. Molly was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Clay was sentenced to 30 years in prison, plus 20 more years for probation violations. Molly has since been paroled, while Clay is still in jail. On the evening of March 25th, 2017, a 25-year-old farmer named Akbar Solabiro was harvesting palm fruit at the local oil palm grove near his tiny village in Indonesia. Now, the way Akbar would do this is he would use this long curved pole and he would prod at the bright red fruit in the tree, knocking it to the ground, and then he would gather it up, put it in his cart, and wheel it back home to be sold for palm oil. Now, on this night, Akbar was actually working later than usual because his wife and kids were out of town for a couple of days visiting family, and so there was no real reason to head back home because the house was empty. But Akbar was actually just fine with that because there was tons of ripe fruit, and so staying late would be quite profitable. But after a while, when the sun had finally set and it was getting difficult to actually even see the fruit in the tree, Akbar knew he really needed to leave soon because this area at night was actually not safe. And so Akbar gathered up the remainder of his fruit on the ground, he put his pole in the cart as well, and he began quickly making his way back home. Later that evening, one of Akbar's neighbors was asleep in their bed inside of their home when they woke up suddenly to the sound of something out in the jungle, not far from where Akbar had been harvesting palm fruit. And so this neighbor, when they sat up, they couldn't really tell what the sound was. It almost sounded like a stifled scream or maybe some animal that was fighting with another animal. But as the neighbor sat there straining their ears to try to hear it again, they didn't. All they heard was normal sounds coming from the outside. And so the neighbor decided that the sound they heard must have been a cat or maybe a monkey, and whatever it was, it couldn't have been a big deal. And so this neighbor went back to sleep. The following evening, so 24 hours later, another one of Akbar's neighbors walked outside of their home to begin the walk over to the jungle to harvest palm fruit. And when they went outside, normally around this time, Akbar would be coming outside as well, because these two often went to the grove together. But, this neighbor is looking and Akbar's not outside, and he looks up at Akbar's house and it's dark and quiet. And so this neighbor's thinking to themselves, where is Akbar? I know he worked late last night. I didn't hear him come in. And come to think of it, I haven't seen him all day. And now, of course, I'm not seeing him as well. And so this neighbor, feeling concerned about Akbar, walked over and knocked on his door, but nobody answered. And so really starting to think that something could be wrong with Akbar, this neighbor went to Akbar's uncle's house. And when Akbar's uncle came to the door, this neighbor explained what was going on, and they're concerned that, something could have happened to Akbar. And so the uncle and this neighbor would go back over to Akbar's home, and they would actually try the door. It was locked. They looked inside the windows, and it looked like no one was in there. And they also noticed that where Akbar typically kept his cart that he would transport his fruit in, it wasn't there either, which made them think, Akbar must still be out somewhere with this cart, because this cart is very important to him. And so ultimately, the uncle, after seeing the state of his nephew's home, he agreed with this neighbor that, something was wrong here. And if they wanted to find Akbar, they really needed to get together a search party right now and go looking for him. So the uncle contacted the leaders of the village, and they in turn rounded up all the able-bodied men in the village, and they all got together with headlamps and flashlights and machetes and knives, and then all together they began walking away from the village into the jungle in the direction of this palm grove, which was the place that Akbar had been last. And so this big group of men, they get inside the jungle and they begin walking along this path, which was the most likely path that Akbar would have taken to go to the palm grove and also to return from the palm grove. And as they're walking, the sun is starting to set, it's getting dark, and the animals in the jungle, they're all making noises and kind of yelling at this group as they're moving through. And this group, they're shining their light around looking for any sign of Akbar, but there wasn't any. They were calling his name out, there was no response. And then at some point, as they got closer to the palm grove, they noticed there were a couple of bright red fruits, palm fruits, that had clearly been recently harvested that were scattered on the trail. And so the group began to fan out in this area, thinking that, oh my goodness, Akbar must be somewhere nearby. Maybe there was some sort of accident and he's fallen somewhere, or just something's happened to him, but he's got to be in this area. And so the group began fanning out off the trail, kind of hacking their way through all the underbrush. And then suddenly, one of the men, after he hacked through a particularly dense stretch of the jungle, he looked down and saw something and began to scream, and he raised his machete and began running forward. As far as we can tell, this is what happened to Akbar. The previous night, after Akbar had decided, it wasn't safe to be in the jungle at night, he needed to leave, and so he gathered up all of his things and he began walking along that path where the search party would find all that fruit scattered on the trail. And so he's walking along this path and he thinks he's alone, he thinks he's okay, but in reality, he wasn't. He was being watched and followed very closely from something up in the trees. And so as Akbar moved along, this thing was kind of trailing him and seeing what he was going to do. And then at some point, this thing up in the trees began moving its way down closer and closer to Akbar. It was a 23-foot long reticulated python. It was a massive snake. And this snake came down and launched an attack on Akbar, grabbing the back of his neck with its powerful jaws. And as soon as the snake clamped down on Akbar's neck, he let out a stifled scream, which was the scream that had woken up that other neighbor who sat up in bed wondering what that was. That was Akbar screaming out. But that was the only sound Akbar could make, because immediately the snake wrapped itself all around Akbar and squeezed him tight. And after crushing Akbar, breaking almost every bone in his body, the snake relaxed and then slithered off of Akbar. And so Akbar fell to the ground and was either dead or very close to death. And at this point, the snake opened up its jaws and positioned itself right in front of Akbar's head. And then it began kind of slithering itself forward, consuming Akbar head first. And the way pythons do this is they don't really chew on their victim. Instead, they kind of put their mouth over the top of whatever they're going to consume, and they kind of undulate and walk their bodies forward, driving the victim deeper and deeper into their body until they are completely consumed. And so the next night, when one of the members of the search party had gone off the trail and began hacking away and then saw something and charged after it with his machete, what he was seeing was the python, who very clearly had a person inside of its stomach. You could see the outline of the person. And so this search party member ran forward and hacked the snake, opened it up, and there was Akbar fully dressed and deceased inside of the snake. On the night of February 19th, 2022, a 41-year-old woman named Paula Ruiz was working the reception desk at a 4-star hotel in southern Mexico. It had been a long Saturday night with lots of tourists checking in and lots of confused tourists asking for directions or clarifications about things in the area. But it was finally nearing 11 p.m., which was the end of Paula's shift, and also things had calmed down near the reception desk. There wasn't much going on. And so Paula took a moment and grabbed her phone and checked it. And she saw there was a text message from her 19-year-old son saying he would be picking her up after work on his motorbike. And then just a couple of minutes later, Miguel, her son, actually walked in the front door of the hotel. He waved to his mom and said, hey, I parked my motorbike just down the street. Whenever you're ready, we can leave. And so Paula, she was very happy to see her son. She walked over, she gave him a kiss and a hug, and then she began gathering her things. Paula loved the fact that her son was totally comfortable driving around town with his mom on the back of his motorcycle. Other teenagers might think that was awkward, but not Miguel. But Paula knew her son absolutely loved his motorbike and basically was always looking for an excuse to ride it. And so very likely that was why he was so eager to give his mom a ride home. And so finally, after Paula had gathered up her things and said goodbye to her coworkers, she and her son walked out the front doors of the hotel, and they began walking down the road and around the corner to where Miguel always parked his bike whenever he picked his mom up from work. However, when they turned the corner and looked at the spot where Miguel said he had parked, his bike wasn't there. Now, at first, Paula asked Miguel, are you sure you parked it here? Maybe did you park it farther down the road? But Miguel said, no, this is where I always park. I definitely parked it right here. And so Miguel became convinced that someone must have stolen his bike. That was the only explanation that made sense. But Miguel still had the keys to his motorcycle, which meant whoever had stolen it had likely hotwired it. And since that takes quite a bit of time to pull off components of the bike and kind of fiddle around with the wires to make it start, Miguel was thinking that, okay, maybe they're still in the area trying to hotwire it. Let's go look for them and get the bike back. Now, the city in southern Mexico where Paula and Miguel lived was called San Cristobal de las Casas, and it was a totally beautiful place surrounded by all these hills, but it was also a very dangerous place, full of lots of street crime and violence and gangs that used the area as a hotspot for drug trafficking. And so this is not really a good place to be walking around at night, let alone trying to chase down some bike thief. But Paula and Miguel, they knew this. They lived there. They understood the risks. And Paula especially, she knew that Miguel was going to go looking for this bike because he loved that bike. And so Paula didn't hesitate and said, okay, Miguel, let's go looking. And she figured at a minimum, she could take a video or a picture of the thief if they found them with the bike, and then they could give that to police, and then maybe they could track the person down if Miguel and Paula couldn't get the bike back that night. And so Paula and Miguel began running down these side streets, looking all over the place for Miguel's bike. And you got to picture some narrow alleyways with barely any lighting. I mean, this is a sketchy area. And so they're running around, and then finally they turn a corner and Miguel sees up ahead his distinctive yellow motorbike, and he sees some stranger is pushing it along. Clearly this person is pushing it away so they can hotwire it. And so Miguel and Paula begin charging down the road, and Miguel actually gets in front of this guy and stops him, and Miguel starts screaming at the guy to give him his bike back. And then Paula, she joins her son and she starts screaming at him as well and taking videos and pictures. And then as this is happening, another man on a motorbike came flying up behind Paula and Miguel. And as they did, Paula and Miguel heard the sound of the engine and they turned around, and all Paula saw was this young man holding a gun, aiming it at her son, Miguel, right at his chest. And so her motherly instincts kicked in and she leapt in front of her son, and then not knowing what else to do, she raised her phone and took a picture. And then seconds later, there was a loud bang, and then suddenly this guy who had been trying to steal Miguel's bike gave it up. He dropped the bike, he took off running down the road, and the gunman, he too turned his bike around and sped off down the road, leaving Miguel and Paula in the alleyway. Except Paula was on the ground because a second after she took that photo, the gunman had shot her in the chest. Paula would be taken to the hospital, but she would die the following morning, orphaning Miguel and his 3 siblings. However, the photo that Paula took of her killer seconds before he killed her was such a high-quality photo showing his face that just 2 days after her murder, police were able to use that photo to find the killer as well as his accomplice, and they were both arrested. If you didn't catch my live storytelling event last month on the official MrBallen Discord server, then you kind of missed out. Not only were the stories awesome, at least according to me, but we also temporarily broke Discord because of how many people were trying to watch the event at once. But don't worry, you can be a part of our next live storytelling event on Discord if you just join the MrBallen Discord server, which is completely free. All you have to do is click the link in the description of this video or click the link in any of my social media bios. Also, the MrBallen Discord server is not just a place for live events. It's also a place where I make all of our biggest special announcements, and this summer we have a couple of huge announcements. So if you want to hear those announcements, you gotta get on the MrBallen Discord server. Either click the link in any of my social media bios or click the link in this video's description below. Okay? Back to the stories. On the morning of February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Misha Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress, and immediately Misha knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done. And so Misha, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress and thanked her mom for all the hard work and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Misha, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss, and she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast. She finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye. And then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school, like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, "What's going on? What are you looking at back there?" And Misha's aunt would say, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school." And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road, so it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious. And so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, "I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us." A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt. She thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy, and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile, and then quickly looked away from Misha, and then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared, and she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time. They shared everything with each other. And certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then, the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally, they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first, and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already 2 people inside who she didn't recognize. It was 2 women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the 2 women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the 2 women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, "What photo are you talking about? And really, what's going on here?" these 2 women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them and you can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the 2 women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office and they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug. And it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the 2 women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the 2 women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said, "Okay." And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the 2 women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the 2 social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the 2 women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house. And Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the 3 of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper, and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station, where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there, stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse, which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly, and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things and looked so dramatically similar, is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew, that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. And so they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, Lavana Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that Lavana's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped, because 17 years earlier, Lavana had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and Lavana did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany, when in reality, after Lavana had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that Lavana had stitched for her to her high school dance, well after the news came out about who Lavana was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany. Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic 5th Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors or police officers or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed. And then finally at 2 a.m., he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the two brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off. But instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them. And when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times, just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly, the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the second floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the second floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the second floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling, in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, I mean, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere, and lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn, where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day, as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, He accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was his skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. On the afternoon of June 15th, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being totally abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhere-ness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book, a book that lots of people were going to read, a great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about. And that was why he had come to Silver Plume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, him kind of being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him her blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silver Plume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silver Plume for all of its 140 residents, and the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe. Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silverplume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silverplume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe that used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore, and when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silverplume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silverplume and wound up walking onto this hiking trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, I mean, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that. And so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things. But Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike. And he also had a deep fear of heights. And this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, he was here in Silverplume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below. And so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything is okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, it's totally fine, no big deal. Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life he was going to be living for the next few months. And so along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. And very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment and he would make his way over to the bookstore and he would sit down at his computer and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down, trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive, and he told himself, what, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silver Plume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of all the trees, it was very cool, and the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver. And suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail, and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below. And in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin, who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silver Plume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silver Plume and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silver Plume, how, their town must be cursed, and maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled off his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument and he thought of another strange Silver Plume story, except this one hit much closer to home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silver Plume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods, up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silver Plume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silver Plume. And in Silver Plume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch. But instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silver Plume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument, thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silver Plume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point Keith has been living in Silver Plume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silver Plume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these 2 hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these 2 hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the 2 of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these 2 hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these 2 hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the 2 skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family, and so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those 2 hunters had discovered Tom and Gus, they were partially covered by that green plastic tarp, but it looked very much like the wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located several feet away from where Tom was, it seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. I mean, he was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were dead. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service, because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment, and when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel, and he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was gonna get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. I mean, they had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing. And here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip. And it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, "I hope you're joking." But Keith would say, "I am not joking. And in fact, I'm leaving right now." And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing, and he told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside and the door was locked and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, "Oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened." And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after Keith had gone missing, and so by this point he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom and looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over, and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume, except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday we'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book. He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silver Plume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, Tom discovered, and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing, and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories, because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open.